Well, we know that when we look up this passage in the Gospel of Luke in our Bibles, lots of times if there are titles in our Bibles, it says what? The Good Samaritan story, right? Yeah. How many of you have been receivers of a Good Samaritan? Like, I hope all of us have had somebody help us, right? A stranger that we were stuck with, what? No gas. Or a couple years ago, yeah, the girls, we all went to the Iowa State Fair, and we had one of those torrential rains. And of course, where the girls parked, it was down in a gully, and it just became a big mud pit. And these young teenage strong boys pushed the girls' car out. I think about the times in my life when I have had and been the receiver of Good Samaritans. Didn't even know their names, but they even came into my family home growing up in Des Moines back in '93 when the big flood happened. And they literally scrubbed and cleaned our basement of all that nasty water that had sat there for days and days. How have you been a Good Samaritan to somebody you didn't know? Have you ever stopped and helped somebody? I sure have too. We are a little bit more leery about that nowadays, aren't we? But I remember back in the days of driving down to Culver when I was leaving Des Moines, we didn't have cell phones back then, did we? We didn't have cell phones for a really long time. And if you got stranded, you really got stranded. And you had to sometimes just depend on those good people that were driving by, right? We know that the story reminds us of that wonderful question Jesus asks the lawyer in our story, who is my neighbor? Jesus replied to that question by telling that story, right? Man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and of course he fell into the hands of robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, they beat him, and they left him half dead. He needed lots of Band-Aids. But yet, not only a priest and a Levite, very well-known and reputable people in their community, as they walked by, they saw the man laying on the side of the road, half dead, needing lots of Band-Aids. And yet they did not stop. They even went so far as crossing over to the other side to walk on by. But it was that Iowan, that Samaritan, that as he walked by and came up to the point in the road where the man was, that not did he just see them, but he took pity on him. And then Jesus, after saying to the story, which of the three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? And of course, the answer was so obvious, the inquirer responded immediately, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus wasn't just talking to that man that he was engaged in conversation, but he said to everybody present that day listening to the story, those simple words, go and do likewise. I find it very funny and interesting that we all know as Christians this story really super well. We've probably been taught it over and over again since we were tiny teeny in Sunday school right here in this church, right? But nowhere in the actual parable of the Good Samaritan is the word good. Have you ever noticed that? No. Throughout the years, though, good has become synonymous with the man who dared to be a neighbor to the stranger. And I think forever on, we will always just call him not the Samaritan, but the Good Samaritan, right? So let's think about this morning. Why is it that he is more than just a man, but he's good? Well, for one thing, he did not turn his back on someone in distress. Now, I don't know about you, but that's kind of my first reaction, right? Is that if we see somebody who is hurting, and especially if there's a lot of blood, I am not going to be jumping right in and helping. I think I've learned to kind of overcome some of that now that I've been in the hospital and I've actually stood bedside in the emergency department and I've seen stuff squirting everywhere. I've gotten a little better at tolerating it. But we know that when we see somebody hurting, bad car accident, right? We might look, but we don't really want to see anything awful. And unfortunately, that's what happened in the story. The priest and the Levite did just that. I don't know if they even went by and did this when they saw the hurt man. But it is kind of sad to think that the religious leaders in the community ignored the forsaken traveler. And we can only guess and scratch our heads why they passed by. Maybe they had real good reasons. Because according to ceremonial Jewish law, you became unclean if you touched somebody's blood. And so therefore, looking at the man, probably thought he was not only bleeding, but that he was almost dead. And you definitely didn't touch a dead person. I don't know what Hannah's gonna do. She's in big trouble. No, we know that's sacred work, right? Maybe the two men were in a hurry, right? They didn't want to be inconvenienced by having to stop out of their busy day as they were walking from one place to another. But whatever the reason is, both of those first two men turned their back. And the Samaritan was good because he turned his face towards the man. He didn't turn his back. He showed him simple human kindness. Mark Twain once wrote, "Kindness is a language that the deaf can hear and the blind can read." And I think that's a great quote, and he's so right, of course, right? Everyone can understand the language of love and compassion. It can be spoken in any dialect and can be comprehended by any person or nationality. It can be understood if you're rich or if you're poor, if you're young or if you're old, if you're male or if you're female. We all understand that kindness is a universal language, for it does not speak to your intellect, but it talks directly to your heart. The Samaritan was good because he spoke the language of kindness. And even though he was a Samaritan and the beaten traveler was a Jew, he still reached out to him. You got to remember that Jews and Samaritans, people from Samaria, they were kind of like rivals. They definitely wouldn't go out of their way to offer them a cup of water if they were in a dry desert. But for whatever reason, this Samaritan, he was good. You know, the second thing that is interesting about this story of the Samaritan and why he was good is because he was allowing himself to disrupt his schedule to help the man. You know, time is a precious commodity in our lifetime, right? A Pennsylvania consulting firm once released one of those studies that estimated the time of an average American who was spent doing just various things over the course of their lifetime. And I hate to tell you, but the results were not encouraging. I want you to consider this. Do you know that we spend at least 8 months of our entire life opening junk mail? That we spend at least 6 months worth of time sitting at red stoplights. We spend at least a year's worth of time looking for lost objects. How many of us maybe spend a year and a half? Okay, me, yeah. You know that it takes almost 2 years worth of time to return phone calls, 5 years worth of your life spending time standing in lines. And we know that with precious time, sometimes the greatest charitable Christian act is being able to stop out of our busy lives and just give someone else your bit of time. Kind of interesting that we must be on a Civil War kind of helping story this day, because I want to tell you about Clara Barton. Do we all remember who Clara Barton was? Yeah. She, of course, learned about the terrible plight of the wounded soldiers at the Battle of Second Bull Run. And she, at that time, was living up in Washington, D.C. So she was safe, she was secure, she was nowhere near the battlefield, did not see any of it. However, it touched her heart. And arriving on Sunday, she went to the battlefield of the Second Bull Run to see if she could lend her hand. When she arrived, she ended up laboring all day and on through the night, aiding the stricken men. Exhaustion couldn't even stop her as she bandaged one man after another. And if she wasn't bandaging them, she was consoling them. She worked day and night fearlessly, and it would not deter this nurse from her appointed rounds. As the rebel skirmishes began to pass over the knoll of a nearby hill, Barton continued to work despite the war was getting closer to her. And alone as she treated the injured, there was another medical personnel who boarded the train, hoping to get to the safety of the city and living that horrible, horrible area. Slowly, as the Confederates' forces advanced, soon the hospital would be overrun with sick and injured. And aware of the impending doom, a Union officer rode up to Clara Barton with a mount in her hand and said, "Could you ride a horse bareback?" And of course, nodding, saying she could, she jumped up and the officer yelled, "Then can you risk another hour? Would you work another hour in a war zone to help these wounded men?" is what the man said. And with bullets that passed by her, she stayed yet another hour to help care and bandage the men. You know, the Samaritan, when he stopped along the side of the road that day to assist the fellow traveler, he was yet willing to risk another hour. He was willing to take the risk of getting involved. He was willing to sacrifice his time to help somebody else. He was willing to surrender some of his belongings, his items that he may have needed, and he used them on somebody who was technically a stranger and an enemy. He was willing to even use some of his own coin money at the inn for a man who had none because he had been robbed. We know that to be good, sometimes it means we have to risk an hour of our time. And seldom do we schedule that time. Yes, we volunteer, and I'm glad we do. I'm glad we go to places like the food bank and that we help at the hospital, and we might be a driver, or we might help take somebody to a doctor's appointment. But in those specific moments when there's real tragedy, do we get the opportunity to jump in? And usually it is not something that we plan, but it's something thrust upon us, and we're not in anywhere prepared for it. Inconvenience will always be our first thought, and unwillingness might be our next desire. But if we remember this story, we can't help remember we all need to be good. We all need to be Samaritans, to swallow our pride and our prejudice and be willing to help and take the time. That brings us to, then why do we call him good? because the Samaritan showed himself that he was capable of the highest act of human consciousness, that he showed empathy. He was someone who was walking by and saw a traveler who had been stripped and beaten and was in desperate need. And we all know that none of us ever escape from human tragedy. It's something that we all experience in our lifetime. It's heartache, it is sorrow. We all may end up having a serious illness, or we have to have surgery. We all lose people that we love, and at one time or another, we have understood what it means to lose dreams and shattered ambitions. All those things that we worked so hard for, money and power and prestige, none of that protects us from knowing that tragedy happens. As we walk along the roads of our life, we are no different whether we are rich or poor, old or young, male or female. Tragedy comes into our lives. And Jesus hopes that we will entertain another person's weary agony as if it was our own. We all know that life brings goodness and wonderful joys, but that yes, sometimes there are moments where we are just so scared and terrified. And this week has been one of those weeks where we have seen it in people's faces. We have heard about parents who have lost children. We have heard of parents who have lost their own parents, the elderly. There have been immigrants that have gone missing and they have no idea where they are. We have heard about the tragic flooding down in Texas, and then lo and behold, we have the taste of it our own this weekend in our own neighborhood with a tornado and with some flooding. We all experience those things, and I myself, as a hospital chaplain for 4 years, have sat beside folks who not only were maybe losing their 90-year-old parent, but I sat by and held an infant that died that was merely days old. I never thought that that was something I would experience, but I am grateful that God has put those experiences before me so that if and when something like that happens to the people I love in my own church that I serve, I can sit and be empathetic, and I can say a kind word or just hold a hand and be present. You know, Mother Teresa once put it like this: the biggest disease today is not leprosy or cancer, but it's the feeling of being uncared for and unwanted, of being deserted and alone. And the greatest evil is the lack of love and charity and an indifference toward one's neighbor who may be the victim of poverty or disease or exploited or at the end of his life, left at a roadside. We, my friends, all need to see our neighbor's distress as our own desperate need. The Samaritan was good because he saw in the traveler Christ himself. I don't know if the Samaritan would have expressed it that way, but that's how Christ basically shared the story. That when Jesus said, "When you do this unto the least of these," he meant you're doing it as if you were caring for me. And what Christ means is he wants us to treat everyone we meet as if we were meeting him and caring for him. Walt Whitman expressed it like this: in the faces of men and women, I see God. And in the face of every forsaken pilgrim stranded along the roads of life, we must perceive and see our Lord. Because the man from Nazareth once said, "Do this to the least of these." My friends, I know you are all good. But wouldn't it be great to be known as the Good Samaritan? Because people know that you are kind and generous and willing to pause out of your life to say, friend, what can I do to help you today? Amen. Amen.